Hello, everybody. I had a important document I wanted to share with everyone. I will be going live tonight as scheduled at 6 o'clock, and I'll be going through the Mark Meadows notice for going to federal court and the response from the government. But one of the exhibits from the response by the government is Exhibit D that she set out. Now, this is a report from the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. This was done November 9th of 2021. This report, I think, is so crucial to understanding what's happening with this idea of moving this to federal court. I really wanted to read through it. So I've turned off comments just so that I can read through the material. People can kind of come and go as they like. And I'll be able to upload it later. But this report is just really important in understanding how the process is working for removing any of these cases to federal court. I've gone through the report already once, and it's not a long read, but it's very detailed and very well put together. So I will just be reading through this. I will be taking questions later. I plan on going live at 6 o'clock, my normal scheduled time. This was just the time that I had available to make this document open and available for everyone. So let's get started. Investigation of political activities by senior Trump administration officials during the 2020 presidential election. Again, this document was set as an exhibit to the government's response for the notice to remove the Georgia case to federal court. It's dated November 9th of 2021. Here's our table of contents. First, we'll start out with the executive summary. Next, we'll go into the Hatch Act. Many people have been asking about that. Part 3, the pervasive Hatch Act violations in the Trump administration. We'll go into the 2020 Republican National Convention generated substantial public discussion of the Hatch Act and an unprecedented number of Hatch Act complaints. Number 2, the OSC received numerous complaints alleging that senior Trump administration officials violated the Hatch Act in the months prior to the 2020 election. Number 3, what is the legal standard required to establish a Hatch Act violation? The employees described in this part were all covered by the Hatch Act. This is an essential element. If you are trying to take your case to federal court, claiming you were doing it under the guise of your job as a federal official, but yet as a federal official, you can violate the Hatch Act. It is a prohibited use of official authority for an employee to support or oppose a candidate for partisan political office while acting in an official capacity. Number 4, the subject officials violated the Hatch Act by campaigning on behalf of the President Trump's reelection while acting within the scope of their official duties. 11 senior Trump administration officials violated the Hatch Act during official interviews or media appearances. Factual findings. This again is a table of contents. Secretary of Energy Dan Brulette, Senior Counselor to the President, Kellyanne Conway, White House Director of Strategic Communication, Alyssa Farah, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, Senior Advisor to the President, Jared Kushner, White House Press Secretary, Kelly McEnany, White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, and this is the key here, excuse me, Senior Advisor to the President for Policy, Stephen Miller, White House Deputy Press Secretary, Brian Morgenstern, National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, Chief of Staff to the Vice President, Mark Short. Again, these are the listed names of people who have had some factual findings of violations of the Hatch Act. That takes us to page 2, the analysis. We'll look at senior Trump administration officials that violated the Hatch Act during the Republican National Convention. Factual findings include Secretary of State Michael Pompeo and the Jerusalem speech. The analysis regarding Secretary of State Michael Pompeo and the Jerusalem speech. Factual findings of Acting Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf and the naturalization ceremony. And the analysis, Acting Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf Chad Wolf and the naturalization ceremony. The Trump administration ignored the Hatch Act and approved of senior officials illegally campaigning on behalf of President Trump. The Trump administration refused to hold senior officials accountable for violating the Hatch Act, and in at least one case publicly defended a senior official who OSC found violated the act. The Trump administration took no apparent action to control or prevent senior administration officials from committing frequent and similar violations of the Hatch Act. Part 4, enforcement challenges. So the report goes into the problems enforcing the actual provisions of the Hatch Act. OSC enforcement tools are limited with respect to Senate-confirmed presidential appointees and White House commissioned officers. OSC did not receive from the Trump administration the good faith cooperation necessary to ensure full compliance with the Hatch Act. Prior OSC advice to executive branch agencies that the Hatch Act does not prohibit agencies from defending an administration's policies positions appeared to have been interpreted in a way that allowed senior agency officials to engage in political activity under the guise of defending the Trump administration's policy positions. OSC does not have the authority to issue or update Hatch Act regulations. Existing law is unclear with respect to which portions, if any, of the White House may be used for public partisan political events and who may authorize such uses. These are the problems that they were finding in their investigation. OSC has no clear mechanism for obtaining reimbursement for taxpayers when a government official engages in taxpayer-funded campaign activity while on official government travel. And the MSPB has not had a quorum since January of 2017. And then part 5 goes into the conclusion. So let's go into the different pieces of this report. Again, this is an official report that came out in November of 2021. Part 1, Executive Summary. This report presents the United States Office of Special Counsel's, OSC, investigative findings and conclusions regarding complaints OSC received largely in response to the 2020 Republican National Convention, alleging that senior Trump administration officials used their official authority or influence to interfere with or affect the 2020 presidential election in violation of the Hatch Act. As described herein, OSC investigated those complaints and determined that hosting the RNC at the White House did not itself violate the Hatch Act, but that at least 13 senior Trump administration officials did violate the Hatch Act prior to the election. Each of these high-profile violations was committed by an official OSC believes, based on current law, could only have been disciplined by the then President Donald J. Trump. Thus, the cases described herein demonstrate both a willingness by some in the Trump administration to leverage the power of the executive branch to promote President Trump's reelection and the limits of OSC's enforcement power under the existing statutory scheme to prevent them from doing so. OSC is issuing this report to educate employees about Hatch Act prohibited activities, highlight the enforcement challenges of the OSC confronted during this investigation, and deter similar violations in the future. During a press conference on August 5th of 2020, President Trump was asked about the Hatch Act implications of using the White House as a venue for the RNC. He responded, quote, "There is no Hatch Act because it doesn't pertain to the president," end quote. Although true that the president is exempt from the Hatch Act, the law most certainly does apply to senior members of the president's administration. Nonetheless, with respect to an administration's senior-most officials, whom only the president can discipline for violating the Hatch Act is only as effective in ensuring a depoliticized federal workforce as the president decides it will be. Whereas happened in the Trump administration, the White House chooses to ignore the Hatch Act's requirements. There is currently no mechanism for holding senior administration officials accountable for violating the law. Part 2 of this report briefly describes the history of restrictions of federal employees' political activity and the developments that led Congress to pass the Hatch Act in 1939. It focuses in particular on why Congress chose to prohibit federal employees from using their official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting elections. Each of the violations described in Part 3 implicates that prohibition. Part 3 contains OSC's determination that some officials in the Trump administration intentionally ignored the law's requirement and tacitly or expressly approved of senior administration officials violating the law. Many of the complaints that prompted this investigation were filed during or after the RNC, which, because of the coronavirus pandemic, featured events held on White House grounds. As far as OSC is aware, it was the first political party convention since the passage of the Hatch Act to do so. The complaints raised 3 issues. The first issue is whether President Trump or then Vice President Michael Pence violated the Hatch Act. Neither did, because both the President and the Vice President are expressly exempt from the coverage under the provisions of the Hatch Act that OSC enforces. The second issue is whether the Hatch Act prohibits a political party from holding a convention at the White House. It does not. The Hatch Act only applies to federal executive branch employees, assuming that the President or the Vice President, neither of whom is subject to the Hatch Act, authorizes use of the White House for a political convention, and the convention itself is produced by non-federal employees. That circumstance alone would not violate the Hatch Act. And as OSC and publicly during the PNC ambiguities in existing law means that there are certain areas of the White House and its grounds in which even federal employees are permitted to engage in political activity. The final issue is whether a number of senior Trump administration officials violated the Hatch Act in connection with the RNC or otherwise prior to the 2020 election. OSC concludes that at least 13 senior Trump administration officials did so, and furthermore that they did so with the administration's approval. Under current law, OSC may seek disciplinary action up to and including removal from federal service against most federal employees who violate the Hatch Act by prosecuting alleged violations before the Merit Systems Protection Board. But in the case of violations by Senate-confirmed presidential employees and, in OSC's view, also by commissioned officers within the executive office of the president, OSC may only submit a report to the president. This is both legally required, as OSC believes there are significant constitutional concerns with the MSPB disciplining commissioned officers, and as a practical matter, the only recourse available to OSC when there is no MSPB quorum, as was the case during the entirety of Trump's administration. It is then up to the president to discipline those employees. President Trump not only failed to do so, but he publicly defended an employee OSC found to have repeatedly violated the Hatch Act. This failure to impose discipline created the conditions for which appeared to be a taxpayer-funded campaign apparatus within the upper echelons of the executive branch. And it allowed for, as one federal court said of a senior administration official, members of the administration to, quote, violate the Hatch Act with seeming impunity, end quote. OSC received complaints alleging that the 13 senior Trump administration officials listed in Part 3 violated the Hatch Act in one of 2 ways: by making statements supporting or opposing a candidate for partisan political office while speaking in an official capacity, or by using their official authority in connection with and in furtherance of the RNC. Section 7223 sub A sub 1 of Title V of the U.S. Code prohibits federal executive branch employees from using their official authority or influence to interfere with or affect the results of an election. Under that prohibition, it is illegal for an employee to support or oppose a candidate for partisan political office while acting in an official capacity. Yet Trump administration officials did. Precisely that. And while the specific facts of each case are different, they share this fundamental commonality. Senior Trump administration officials chose to use their official authority not for the legitimate function of the government, but to promote the re-election of President Trump in violation of the law. The administration's willful disregard for the law was especially pernicious considering the timing of when many of these violations took place. OSC cannot, in most cases, stop violations from happening in real time. Even apparently straightforward violations of the Hatch Act may not turn out to actually be violations upon further investigation. Therefore, investigating alleged violations is the only way to ensure a fair result. Accordingly, OSC affords appropriate due process to the subject of a complaint and gathers the relevant facts before reaching a conclusion. As a result, OSC's investigations can often stretch out for weeks or even months. This reality creates a window for an administration that is so inclined to ignore the Hatch Act in the final months of an election cycle, knowing full well that any public report or disciplinary action would not likely occur until well after the election. However, the benefit to the administration and resultant harm, the use of the official authority or influence to interfere with or affect an election, would accrue on or before Election Day. As described in Part 3, OSC has concluded that the Trump administration tacitly or expressly approved myriad Hatch Act violations committed within the critical period immediately prior to the 2020 election, during which OSC was unable to both investigate and resolve the violations before Election Day. Now, I'll take you through the last couple of paragraphs here, and then I will just show you the rest of the report. Many of the officials who violated the Hatch Act when speaking in an official capacity during media interviews expressly referenced the 2020 election campaign and or the candidacy of President Trump's principal opponent, then candidate Joseph R. Biden Jr., and his running mate, then candidate Kamala Harris. For example, Brian Morgenstern, then a White House deputy press secretary, said in one interview that candidate Biden was, quote, hiding away, because the Biden campaign knows, quote, the more America sees of their ticket, the less they will like them, end quote. Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, said in an interview, quote, I expect the president to be reelected, and reelected overwhelmingly, end quote. And moments later, rhetorically asked, who do you want to turn to rebuild the economy? The guy who's proven he can do it, President Trump, or somebody who's been in Washington for 40 years, end quote. And Mark Short, then the vice president's chief of staff, said during one interview that the election would, quote, present a tremendous contrast to the American people to choose between a freedom and opportunity agenda that the Trump-Pence administration stands for versus a path to socialism and decay that we believe the Biden-Harris ticket stands for, end quote. In short, each official campaigned on behalf of President Trump while speaking as a representative of the United States government. The decision by some in the Trump administration to flout the law by commingling campaign-related activity and governmental operations is further illustrated by the two cases related to the RNC. The first involves then Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, who OSC concludes violated the Hatch Act by changing U.S. Department of State Department policy to allow himself to speak at the convention, and then, when engaging in political activity, by delivering that speech, using his official authority by repeatedly referencing the work of the State Department. The second involves then acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, who OSC concludes violated the Hatch Act by presiding over a naturalization ceremony that was orchestrated for the purpose of creating content for the convention. Each took official acts in furtherance of President Trump's re-election campaign. It appears that both violations stemmed from requests that originated within the White House, or in Secretary Pompeo's case, possibly the Trump campaign or President Trump himself, and thus they reflect the Trump administration's willingness to manipulate government business for partisan political ends. Again, just a few paragraphs left here to the beginning analysis. Trump administration officials knew that the Hatch Act's restrictions. Prior to the 2020 election, OSC issued 2 reports to President Trump documenting Hatch Act violations by a senior administration official and an unprecedented 15 warning letters to senior administration officials notifying them that they had violated the Hatch Act. And OSC made itself available and did provide advice on the Hatch Act to the White House, as well as training materials and advisory opinions when requested. Well aware of the Hatch Act's requirement, some senior officials in the Trump administration disregarded OSC's advice and chose to engage in prohibited political activity anyway. From OSC's perspective, the administration's attitude towards Hatch Act's compliance was succinctly captured by then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, who said during an interview that, quote, "Nobody outside of the Beltway really cares," end quote, about Trump administration officials violating the Hatch Act. In direct contradiction to that unfortunate comment, OSC was inundated with calls, emails, and complaints from members of the public in response to the violations described in this report. The cumulative effect of these repeated and public violations was to undermine public confidence in the nonpartisan operation of government. Equally troubling, the obvious noncompliance by senior administration officials also caused career federal employees to ask OSC whether they were still required to comply with the Hatch Act. As OSC previously stated in a letter to President Trump documenting Hatch Act violations by a senior administration official, such flagrant and unpunished violations erode the principal foundation of our democratic system, the rule of law. Part 4. Again, this is just an overview. I won't be reading through the entire document, but I'm giving you the overview here. Part 4 lists 7 enforcement challenges that substantially affected OSC's ability to ensure that senior Trump administration officials complied with the restrictions that Congress imposed upon their political activity. Those enforcement challenges and potential fixes for each are as follows. 1. OSC's enforcement tools are limited with respect to the Senate-confirmed presidential appointees and the White House commissioned officers. Then they list out the potential fix. Number 2, OSC did not receive from Trump administration the good faith cooperation necessary to ensure full compliance with the Hatch Act. They're saying we should have a statutory amendment that grants greater authority to this group here. Number 3, prior OSC Hatch Act advice to executive branch agencies that the Hatch Act does not prohibit agencies from defending an administration's policies appears to have been interpreted in a way that allowed senior agency officials to engage in political activity under the guise of defending the Trump administration's policy positions. And here's their suggestion for a fix. Number 4, OSC does not have the authority to issue or update Hatch Act regulations. That's up to Congress. Existing law is unclear with respect to which portions, if any, of the White House may be used for partisan political events and who may authorize such uses. Again, they're asking for a statute in order to clarify that. Number 6, the OSC has no clear mechanism for obtaining reimbursement for taxpayers when a government official engages in taxpayer-funded campaign activity while on official government travel. Number 7, the MSPB has not had a quorum since January of 2017. And here they're asking that be amended so that these kinds of quorums can be put into place. Now here's the conclusion, and then I'll take you through each person that was listed. I won't take you through the whole document, but I'll go through each person. Part 5 concludes by noting that Congress's judgment in passing the Hatch Act was that partisan political activities by federal employees must be limited if the government is to operate effectively and fairly. Elections are to play their proper part in representative government, and employees themselves are to be sufficiently free from improper influences. None of those goals is achievable if the power of the federal government is used to campaign for candidates in partisan elections, as happened during the 2020 election cycle. Moving forward, senior executive branch officials must not allow compliance with the Hatch Act to be viewed as optional or an unnecessary burden. Indeed, lower-ranking employees have faced and continue to face potentially severe consequences, including removal from federal service for violating this law. OSC hopes that the enforcement challenges identified in this report can be addressed and that the conduct of the Trump administration's officials described in Part 3 turns out to be an anomaly, not a precedent. So let me walk you through the rest of this report. I won't be reading into it, but Part 2 goes into the history of the Hatch Act. Again, it was this idea of kind of separating out official roles from campaigning and politicking. So they go into a lot of that language here, all the way to page 9. And then we go into Part 3, pervasive Hatch Act violations in the Trump administration. I'll walk you through just the bullet points here. In this part, we address the following: the 2020 Republican National Convention and the unprecedented number of Hatch Act complaints the public filed with the OSC concerning the event, the myriad allegations of Hatch Act violations by senior Trump administration officials, the legal standard required to establish a Hatch Act violation, OSC's factual findings and legal conclusions with respect to the allegations, and the pattern of conduct by those senior Trump administration officials that led OSC to conclude that the administration tacitly or expressly approved of them violating the Hatch Act. Now, let me walk you through again. They're setting out here the different pieces of that RNC, Republican National Convention situation, and then they go each point by point. Now, under this particular section, they do pull out particular names. So let me take you through these bullet points. Then Secretary of Energy Dan Brulette, by promoting President Trump's re-election campaign during an official interview on this particular show on October 26. These are specific instances of Hatch Act violations. Then Senior Counselor to the President, Kellyanne Conway, by promoting President Trump's re-election campaign during official interviews on Fox News on August 12th and 18. And another violation, the White House Director of Strategic Communications, Alyssa Farah, by promoting President Trump's re-election campaign during an official interview on FNC on October 9th. Again, I'm just summarizing these different pieces. We have, again, specific instances. Then U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, by promoting President Trump's re-election campaign during an official interview with this particular company on October 4th. Then Senior Advisor to President Jared Kushner, by promoting President Trump's re-election campaign during an official interview on CNN on August 23rd. Then White House Press Secretary Kelly McEnany, by promoting President Trump's re-election campaign during an official interview on FNC August 20th, during official remarks to the press, so during an actual press conference on October 23rd. Again, these are violations that the Special Counsel found of the Hatch Act. Then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Again, this is really important for this issue that's coming out of Georgia, where Mr. Meadows has tried to remove his case to federal court, claiming he was acting under his official duty for the things that were set out in the Georgia indictment. So here we go. He's been held to have violated it by promoting President Trump's re-election during official interviews on FNC July 6th and with Politico on August 26th, and by promoting the campaign of congressional candidate Madison Cawthorn during an interview on FNC on July 6th. Then Senior Advisor to the President for Policy Stephen Miller, by promoting President Trump's re-election campaign during an official interview on FNC July 31st. Then White House Deputy Press Secretary Brian Morgenstern, by promoting President Trump's re-election during official interviews on One America News Network on October 9th and 27th. Again, these are all violations of the Hatch Act. Then National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, by promoting President Trump's re-election during the official interview on the Hewitt Show on June 25th. Then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo by changing U.S. Department of State policy to allow himself to speak in support of President Trump's re-election at the RNC, and then by using his official authority when giving that speech. So that's pretty significant that he's actually changing the language of the rules so that he can make this speech. Then Chief of Staff to the Vice President, Mark Short, by promoting President Trump's re-election during official interviews on Fox Business on June 22nd and August 13th, and also during an official interview with the group Campus Reform on August 27th. And last, then Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, and other Trump administration officials by presiding over or orchestrating a naturalization ceremony for the purpose of creating content for the RNC. Again, these are the violations of the Hatch Act that Special Counsel found during their investigation. Next, they set out the legal standard, which is required in order to establish violations of the Hatch Act. We're looking to two sections of the code here, 7322, 7323, which they set out and explain in detail here. Again, I'm just going to kind of go through this a little further. And as an overview, next, the subject officials violated the Hatch Act by campaigning on behalf of the president's reelection, and going through again, stating who was involved. Now we've got factual findings, so let me take you through each person here, and then I will wrap up with a conclusion. A, Secretary of Energy Dan Brulette. He appeared on the Brian Kilmeade show in his official capacity on October 26th and made the following statements. It's an enormous deal. What it would do is move us back to dependence on foreign nations. It moves us back into a state of dependence on Middle East, and it's really a fundamental question, Brian, that Americans need to ask themselves. Is that where we want to go back? Is that what we want to go back to? And you know the amount of jobs lost would be enormous. The past administration nearly killed coal. They did everything they possibly could to do this to coal. So when they say that they want to do this to oil and gas, a word to the wise, believe them. End quote. The host later stated, the energy stocks are taking a pounding now. There's a fear that Biden could win, and no one's buying that the former vice president is going to leave fossil fuels alone, that he was misinterpreted. He responded, Secretary Brulette, by amplifying the host's concern that candidate Biden would not leave fossil fuels alone if he were to win the election. No one should buy it. As I said earlier, look, you know, when they say they will kill oil and gas, they mean it. They've done it with coal here in the United States, and no one should misquote them. No one should ignore their words. It's very important. Those are the quotes then for Mr. Brulette. Next, senior counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway. She appeared on FNC in her official capacity August 12th and 18th. During these interviews, she made the following comments regarding the selection of Kamala Harris as his running mate, questioning the then candidate Kamala Harris's qualifications. This is again from Kellyanne Conway. She's a safe and unsurprising pick in my view. I think we can do two things as a nation. We can stop and applaud when history is made in our fragile young democracy, and then we can also call into question what perhaps somebody should not be, why somebody should not be the vice president or the president of the United States. After then describing her experience as President Trump's campaign manager, Ms. Conway returned to the topic of candidate Harris's selection and forecast how her election would be detrimental for the United States. In the case of Kamala Harris, it'll be very easy to say somebody who presents as progressive and forward-looking could actually bring our nation backwards on many things that matter to America. So by way of quick example, backwards on all of the economic gains we had, she would raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 35%. They would do away with all gains we've had as a nation through our Paycheck Protection Program and Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Why is this important? Because so many Americans benefited from those simple measures, our deregulation agenda. Moments later, Ms. Conway continued her critique of candidate Harris. Again, these are findings of violations of the Hatch Act. These are tough jobs, and we should look at the qualifications for the job. This is a woman who's for abortion in the 9th month. She's against the Second Amendment. She's against parts of the First Amendment. Frankly, she will raise your taxes. She will put our regulations back. She's been terrible on criminal justice. And may I just say, Sandra, as a last point, the Democrats rejected her. During the August 18th interview, Ms. Conway attacked both the Democratic Party and its presidential nominee candidate, Biden. Of the party, she said its convention would be a swamp reunion and contrasted it with an upcoming Republican convention, which she characterized as the People's Convention. She also said that the Democratic Convention showed that the Democratic Party itself has no confidence in the competence of their nominee, Joe Biden. Well, that's not very nice. Who Ms. Conway said had done less than 47 years in Washington than Donald Trump has done in 47 months in Washington. And then next we go on to Ms. Farah. Now, she's got a few more things. It is not within my nature to repeat such negative comments, so I will draw your attention to them, but then move along. Ms. Farah said multiple statements again, promoting this campaigning for President Trump, which are violations of the Hatch Act, along with the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. He went in during a speech and made his showing and his support for President Trump apparent, along with putting down Joe Biden as well as Obama. And again, going into the COVID issues. Now, we've got White House Chief of Staff. I will spend a little bit of time on this one because he's the issue that we will be discussing later tonight on the live. So I will read through his, but kind of summarize the rest. Here we go. Mr. Meadows gave 3 interviews in his official capacity. Again, this is the key why he thinks this can be removed to federal court, during which he campaigned for President Trump's re-election, or in one case for the election of Madison Cawthorn, who at the time was a candidate for Mr. Meadows' former congressional seat in North Carolina. On July 6th, Mr. Meadows appeared on the FNC program Fox and Friends. One of the hosts gave a brief biography of Mr. Cawthorn, and that he was, quote, ready for the job, and asked Mr. Meadows what he expected would happen in the upcoming election. Rather than pivot from answering a question about a candidate for partisan political office, Mr. Meadows instead responded by saying, quote, well, Madison will be a great member of Congress. Obviously, he'll be a great member of Congress, end quote. Mr. Meadows went on to say that, quote, the people of Western North Carolina have rallied behind him. We'll continue to do so, and in November, we will keep that seat. But not only that seat, we will pick up additional seats because it's time that Congress starts getting things done and helping this president instead of being an obstructionist, end quote. Mr. Meadows then gave 2 interviews in which he discussed President Trump's campaign strategy and attacked candidate Biden. The first was on the FNC program Hannity on July 6th. The second was on the political program Plug In with Playbook on August 26th. During the Hannity interview, after the host mentioned a speech by President Trump, Mr. Meadows said the following. Again, this information is supportive of Hatch Act violations by Mr. Meadows. Not only was it a historic speech, but he laid out really the difference. Are we going to be for anarchy, or are we going to be for the rule of law, making sure that American citizens feel safe once again in their home? This president is willing to do that. Where is Joe Biden? In his basement. You know, it's amazing. We've seen Joe Biden for 40 years talk a good game, but we've seen no results, end quote. And in the plug-in with Playbook interview, Mr. Meadows was asked what President Trump could do in the next 69 days to win the election. He responded by describing the Trump campaign strategy through Election Day. Again, this is key information here to the current case going on in Georgia. Well, I think it's not just what he does over the next 69 days. And so let me just be clear. I'm going to talk in my personal capacity as we talk about some of these things so that we don't get everybody tweeting at me that I'm violating the Hatch Act with the two of you. So from a political standpoint, if I put on my political hat, here's what I see is it's not just what he's going to do in the next 69 days, but it's what he's building on from the 3.5 years prior to that. But it's what he's building on from the next 3.5 years. Okay, wait, but it's taking the next 69 days, focusing on what we've accomplished, but then what are we going to do next? And it's taking it to literally 5 different states. Wisconsin is one of those states. North Carolina is one of those states. Florida is another. Arizona and Pennsylvania. If we look at those states and making sure that we take a message not only about jobs, but also about how we're going to set a different agenda between this president and candidate Joe Biden. Because really, right now, the contrast is still not being made. You know, it's the only contrast that's being talked about is that Joe Biden has been a nice guy for 47 years, and Donald Trump has not been in the last 4 years. And so if we look at that, let's look at the policies that really matter. That's what we're going to try to focus on. It's about hitting those individuals who are real concerned about their job, but also about what the next 4 years might be all about for them. Again, this was discussion from Mr. Meadows during an interview with Plug-in and Playbook before the 2020 election. This will be key again to the Georgia case. Next, we've got senior advisor Stephen Miller. He made some comments as well with some disparaging comments about President Biden. Moving on, Mr. Brian Morgenstern, again, negative comments about the Biden campaign here. Clearly campaigning for President Trump, which is a violation of the Hatch Act's requirement for federal employees. Continuing on, we have Mr. O'Brien here for National Security Advisor. Again, some disparaging comments regarding China in campaigning. Again, this was the Hugh Hewitt show, June 25th. Chief of Staff Mark Short, and again with some disparaging comments about Mr. Biden, President Biden, on June 22nd. And continuing on, he had quite a bit to say. Next, we go into the analysis. I'll just give you a summary here. So they go in and explain how the different sections of the Hatch Act have been violated and the appropriate analysis in order to make those conclusions. Again, they set out a list of all of the people that they found Hatch Act violations. Here, senior Trump administration officials did violate the Hatch Act during the Republican National Convention, and then they go into how they went about doing that as well. Next, factual findings regarding the Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo, during the Jerusalem speech in particular, and they set out examples here as well. Next is the analysis of his Jerusalem speech, again, where he is setting out campaign rhetoric in his official capacity, which is a clear violation of the Hatch Act. Next, we have Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, and the naturalization ceremony. Now, this one is a little different here because they gathered people together and made some content, again, according to this report, going through this process so that that content could be shown at the Republican National Convention. These paragraphs go into details of how they did that. It's a lot. So at the very end, I think they summarize pretty nicely. Furthermore, it's clear that the ceremony itself was problematic under the Hatch Act because this official event was orchestrated to be part of the convention. So I think if it had occurred without the goal being as content, there may not have been such an issue, but that was the reason, the rationale for the ceremony itself. Next, we've got the Trump administration ignored the Hatch Act and approved of senior officials illegally campaigning on behalf of President Trump, which obviously is a clear violation of the Hatch Act. And they set out the problems. They sent letters to President Trump explaining that there were violations. They cited instances as well, explaining that we have got particular people making particular statements that are violations to no effect. The president's refusal to require compliance with the law laid the foundation for the violations described in this part. In each of these instances, senior administration officials used their official authority or influence to campaign for President Trump. Based upon the Trump administration's reaction to the violations, OSC concludes that the most logical inference is that the administration approved of these taxpayer-funded campaign activities. OSC further concludes that these violations likely would not have occurred had the Trump administration made clear to senior officials that they should act in accordance with the Hatch Act and that there would be consequences for violating it. So they're saying if there had been some kind of disciplinary measure set up, they believe that everyone would have come into compliance with the law. The Trump administration took no apparent action to control or prevent senior administration officials from committing frequent and similar violations of the Hatch Act. Again, going into the details and summaries of the different instances where that occurred. Again, we've got that quote from Mr. Meadows during the different interviews, specifically in regards to Joe Biden. Continuing on with Ms. Conway and explaining further that the RNC pieces were to be essentially held at the White House, and that although that in and of itself wasn't a violation, the surrounding issues were. And then that takes us to 4, where they go in and explain why they could not enforce this. They have all these violations against all of these people, but because of how the statute is written and because of the authority of special counsel, they could not enforce it. It was up to the president to enforce and discipline his people, and he was unwilling to do that, is what this report is stating. Again, this is an explanation explaining that. 13 senior Trump officials. Again, there was not any good faith cooperation, is what they're alleging as part 2. And then moving on, the Hatch Act does not prohibit agencies from defending an administration's policy positions. There are some problems innate into the Hatch Act itself with the disciplining procedures and the accountability. So again, and I'm not going to read every sentence in here, primarily because they're really explaining the problems with the Hatch Act and enforcing it. They found the violations, they did the research, they found the evidence, and had no way to hold the people accountable without the assistance of the president, which the president was unwilling to do. And that takes us then to the final conclusion, which is the summary of those kinds of issues. So were there violations of the Hatch Act? Yes, there were multiple violations of the Hatch Act, repeated violations, and each one of these executive people were found to have violated it. Again, the purpose of the Hatch Act is to keep federal employees from campaigning under the color of their position as a federal employee. These are the people that violated them, and these are the specific instances in which they made those violations occur. But yet the Office of the Special Counsel was unable to do any kind of enforcement of sanctions because of how the law itself was written. So that takes us then into the analysis and the enforcement challenges. That is an overview then of the Hatch Act violations that were set out by Special Counsel's office. Let me give you the exact citation in case you wish to pull up this document yourself. Again, this was offered as Exhibit D by the district attorney out of Georgia as part of her response to Mr. Meadows' request for removal of his case in Georgia to federal court. It's Exhibit D. Tonight during my live at 6 o'clock, I will go through her other exhibits along with her rationale. But this particular evidence piece exhibit is the investigation of political activities by senior Trump administration officials during the 2020 presidential election. It was submitted November 9th of 2021. This is a public document that is available to anyone online that is interested in it. And you can go through and read through the exact language of all of this. So I hope this was interesting. I will have this posted up on my Tube of You channel for anyone who would like to kind of go through and look at it one more time. This will be part of a bigger discussion that I will be doing tonight at 6 o'clock on a live, going through that response to Mr. Meadows' notice to remove to federal court. Thank you all very, very much for joining me this afternoon. I appreciate it. Even though I had the comments off, we were able to make it through the material with plenty of time to spare. So hopefully I will see all of you back again later tonight during my live. And again, if you're interested in reading this for yourself, it's a public document available up online. Thank you again. See you all later.